Angela, there seems to be a bit of a shift occurring at the moment in terms of how we understand the nature and purpose of language teaching and learning. Can you give us a sense of how you understand that?
I think that we would have to say that there's been, we're in the middle of a paradigm shift. Every now and then we make changes regularly and all the time, but every now and then there comes a moment when the change is much more marked. And the situation in our world is such now that we really do need to rethink our ways and means of communicating and understanding the processes of communicating. The big shift is that we are moving from seeing language learning as a monolingual endeavour. A monolingual approach is the traditional approach that we have normally had. We have treated the teaching of a language as if it were the only language that existed in the world, and as if it were the only language that the students actually had. And so it is a world. I remember when I started teaching German as a beginning teacher, the teacher's manual told me to speak only in German, not to use any writing, but just to speak German. I spent a whole lesson drawing stick figures on the board, drawing, you name it. I would have turned myself inside out because I was going to do as I was told, and I was told to just speak German. For the first 6 units of that book, I will never forget it. And that day I understood that I could have simply said, this German word means X in English, and we would have done it in 2 minutes had I permitted myself to use, or had I been permitted to use English. But because I was dead set on doing what this method required of me, I did it all in German and wasted a lesson when I could have had a very simple strategy. For whichever language learner we might be talking about, we have to recognise that there are multiple languages at play. The learner comes with his or her own language, English, other languages, and is learning an additional language. In learning that additional language, at every moment for that student, there are at least 2 languages at play. The language of their home and the language being learnt. From the learning point of view, we also need to appreciate that at any point in the learning process, we say that students need to connect their new learning to their prior learning. When a student is learning Chinese, and let us say that that student is an English-speaking student, the only thing that the prior learning that student can connect the new Chinese language to, new for him or her, is the language that they already have. So it is the home language, let us say for an English-speaking student, it's connecting to their English. And so the very process of actually learning the language is a multilingual process. The student is, in his or her mind, forever moving between the languages, singular or plural, that they have and the language that is being learnt. And it's in that sense that it is quintessentially a multilingual process. And I think that has to be understood because it's just so liberating. I was a student like that myself. I used the Italian that I had in order to access French that I was learning, and it was liberating. I never had to learn the vocab. I could look at the word and I knew the meaning because of my Italian. But my teacher did not actually encourage me to do that. It was a movement that came spontaneously. I think it's a movement between the languages in learning that needs to be absolutely nurtured and fostered, promoted.
But you've used the example of Italian and French, which some people may say, well, they're Romance languages, and therefore, there's a lot of similarity. But it's a different proposition for someone English to Chinese, or
of course,
a similar example.
Of course. But that's where the meta language comes in. And if we have the meta language, a noun, a verb in its most simple forms, but then, expressiveness through use of adjectives, relating episodes in time through the use of tenses. We do that in English, and we can transfer those notions to Chinese or whatever the language happens to be. And so we find, for example, with tenses, that they certainly operate differently in Chinese from the way they operate in French. It's absolutely liberating to know that in Chinese you can just mark time by the use of the time marker itself, yesterday, tomorrow, and so on. In French, it's the whole verb system that needs to be learnt and invoked in order to achieve the same thing. But you see, we're not teaching about tenses as such, but we're teaching students about how to relate events, episodes, experiences in time. And so they come to appreciate that this can be done in different ways, in different languages. So they're drawing their understanding of tenses in English to appreciate how and why it works as it does in Chinese. That makes for much deeper learning. Students have to appreciate that even saying hello to someone, you've got to decide in relation to greetings which one is going to be appropriate, because it's not just a question of having the vocabulary, but it's also a question of marking the relationship that we have. So if you are an elder or a person that demands some distance, you would then use in French, you would address them with vous. If it's a person that you know really well, you would address them with tu. In English, we just have the word you, and that's it. In French, we mark that distinction. If we go to Japanese, it's a language that really marks the hierarchy of relationships. That's contained within the language itself. But the phenomenon is at the same time cultural. And so, we are moving between language and the cultural envelope of that phenomenon that we happen to be talking about simultaneously. So in order for me to teach you greetings or how to address a person in French, I would have to talk about how we do that in English. We simply do it in one way. In French, we have to make a distinction between whether it's a child to an adult, whether it is a familiar person or not. And so we need to explain all of that. That's also part of the meta conversation. And it happens, the greetings and addressing people is a very simple example. At every level, whatever phenomenon we talk about, what I've just described there actually is in place. It's linguistic and it's cultural. And we come from the languages and cultures that we know, entering into the space of an additional language, which is a world that we don't know. And we are trying to navigate that movement. And as we navigate, we are also inviting students to stand back from that process and think, okay, what was going on there? such that they develop this meta-understanding of what's involved in that exchange.
I was just thinking of an example in Indonesian, which is the language I teach. One of the hardest things for students to learn in Indonesian is the passive voice.
Oh, yes.
Because for particularly English speakers, we tend to put the subject first, and so there's a strong focus on I or we or the agents, the actors. So a lot of our sentences are constructed with that subject focus, and it's a bit of a cliche, but there is some truth to it, that very often in Indonesian it would be the case that the object or what is affected comes first, and so students find it very hard to swing around their thinking about who is doing what to whom, and so you have to actually engage in who are the doers, who are the those affected by the actions, and so on. So you need to actually go to that more abstract level so that they can actually begin to feel. They actually have to get inside that way of thinking in order to do the language in an appropriate way.
Is that what they call the object focus?
Object focus or passive voice, it's called both.
It's the same, okay. Yes, and to actually shift from I as the centre to having to really turn yourself virtually inside out to say it's not me, it's the object that's the focus.
That's right.
Is monumental.
And what we've tended to do is say, well, this is the rule and follow the rule and learn the rule, but if you don't have the feeling or the insight into the relationship of objects and actions and so on, if you don't have that worldview really, then you can learn the grammar all you like, but you'll never actually be able to generate it in a sort of a natural sense.
And that cultural dimension, that this way of being in relation to another is as much cultural as it is linguistic. And we tended to highlight the linguistic, not the cultural. Now, as Michelle says, you can teach that as a rule, which is what we've done, but there's more to it than that. And that's why we're saying that with the kind of paradigm that we're in now, the students need to be performers, users of the language, but also stand back and become analysers of the language. If the student did not quite understand the object focus construction and began, lunged forth with the I, how would that be received by an Indonesian person? So we've been good at grammatical analysis in language learning. We've actually also been good at the analysis of ideas in text, but we're not as we haven't foregrounded as strongly this notion of what are the consequences in cultural terms if you actually use one construction rather than another.
Teaching in one of my schools with different students with multicultural contexts has been really good. I'm a teacher of Indonesian, and I have students that speak Hindi and other Southeast Asian languages, and Sanskrit is something that kind of leads through to other languages, and they've been able to discover words and understand languages from their own perspectives, bring their own languages in the classroom.
Fabulous. More of it is all that we can say. Now, of course, I want to be very clear. It's not as though you're not still teaching Indonesian. Indonesian is prime, and yes, English is all around your Indonesian classroom. But being attentive to those languages and just a sentence to say, and how does that happen in Hindi, opens up that conversation. It's not stopping what we do in Indonesian, but it is showing and being open to all the rest. Any other manifestations of how you yourselves are dealing with this kind of diversity?
But often I'm really enjoying at the moment of discussing with kids the origin of the English language in the context of the Chinese language and the philosophic backgrounds of how in Latin and in Chinese the concept of univis and unity and one, and you ask the kids, how many words do you know of that have uni in them? And that brings in a total different discussion.
I found the reflection of an ethnic schools teacher on Saturday when we were running a conference for ethnic schools, and she was a Greek teacher, and she said, Angela, how many words in the English language come from Greek? At least 50%, and the other 50% come from Latin. She said, that's what I'm teaching my students. And it's a little bit connected to the example that we have here of etymologies and whatever. Students find some of that kind of information and reflection absolutely fascinating. And those are two really strong examples. If we had time to rush across the whole room, we would find many, many more. That's exactly what we're talking about here. We also have to think that each one of us is also situated in our own language and culture. I cannot stop thinking in French, in German, in Italian as I speak English. My whole world, my stance, my reality is punctuated, is influenced, is enmeshed with all of those languages in everything that we do, in everything that I do, no matter which one I happen to be speaking. And so we ourselves, as teachers, are situated. Every single one of our students is situated in his or her language and culture. And that language and culture, or those languages and cultures, provide us with our cultural home. We are at home in those languages. And so coupled with the languages that we bring is all of the trajectory of our own experiences over a long period of time. That's also enmeshed, it's embodied in us. That's who we are as language teachers. That's how we present ourselves to our students. Our affiliations, our associations with particular languages and cultures are precisely what we can't help but communicate to our students. And so there's an invitation here for a reflective moment as we think globally to also come very, very personal to yourself and say, what's my personal stance? How much of me and my linguistic and cultural repertoire do I share with my students? How does it come into my teaching?